Bang, bang, woodle bang. Imagine for a moment that you're walking on the hull of a sunken warship. It's December 1941, Pearl Harbor is still smoking, and you hear this sound coming from beneath your feet. You know there are living men down there. You know they're hitting the metal with a sledgehammer, begging to be saved, and you also know you can do absolutely nothing about it, because opening that compartment would instantly flood the ship, killing anyone still alive inside. Today I'm going to tell you the most disturbing story that ever emerged from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor. A story the United States Navy tried to hide for decades. A story about 3 young American sailors who survived the initial Japanese attack only to face something much worse. 16 days of agony in a submerged metal tomb. This isn't a story about war heroes in the traditional sense. There are no medals of honor, no glorious charges, no cinematic victories. This is a story about human endurance in its purest and most brutal form. It's about 3 boys who became men in the cold depths of the Pacific, and about the men who were forced to listen to them die. By the end of this video, you'll never look at Pearl Harbor the same way, because behind the heroic narrative we all know, behind the patriotic speeches and solemn memorials, there's a much darker truth about the real cost of war. A truth about what happens when ordinary young people are thrown into extraordinary circumstances, and about the impossible decisions commanders are forced to make. This is the story of Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Louis Costin, 3 names that should be engraved in bronze alongside the other Pearl Harbor heroes, but were deliberately forgotten because their death was too slow, too painful, too human for the official war narrative. December 6, 1941, 11:45 p.m. The USS West Virginia swayed gently at its moorings at berth F6 in Pearl Harbor. It was a typical Hawaiian night, warm, humid, with the sweet aroma of plumeria flowers carried by the Pacific breeze. The moon was almost full, casting a silver path across the calm waters of the bay. On the docks, some sailors on shore leave walked back to their ships, laughing and telling stories of their adventures in Honolulu. Aboard the Wee Vee, as the crew affectionately called the ship, 1,541 men were preparing for sleep. It was Saturday night, and Sunday promised to be a quiet day, maybe a barbecue on the beach, letters home, or simply rest under the tropical sun. Among these men was Ronald James Endicott, 19 years old, Seaman First Class, service number 6547291. Ronald had been born on a small farm outside Zanesville, Ohio, where the horizon was limited by corn-covered hills, and the most exciting adventure was the annual county fair. He was the youngest of 5 children, and the first to leave the county where he was born. Ronald had light brown hair that stubbornly stayed messy, no matter how much brilliantine he used, and blue eyes that his mother, Margaret, always said were the color of a summer sky. He stood 5'9" and weighed 150 pounds, thin but strong from years working on the family farm. His hands were calloused from rural work, but also surprisingly delicate when he wrote letters home every week. Ronald had enlisted in the Navy in May 1941, 6 months earlier, driven by a mixture of patriotism, curiosity about the world, and honestly, the desire to escape the predictable life of the farm. He loved telling other sailors about how he had seen the ocean for the first time when the train took him to boot camp in San Diego. It was like looking at infinity, he wrote to his mother, blue as far as the eye can see, and beyond. Pearl Harbor was his first official posting, and he had arrived in August with wide eyes of admiration. Hawaii was everything he had dreamed of and more. Palm trees bending over white sand beaches, green mountains touching the clouds, and a sky so blue it seemed painted. He loved waking up before dawn to watch the sunrise over the Oahu Mountains, when the sky transformed into a symphony of oranges and pinks. In letters home, Ronald described his life on the ship with the enthusiasm of a young man discovering the world. He told about his roommates, about meals in the mess hall, about training exercises that made him feel part of something bigger than himself. "Mom," he wrote in his last letter, dated December 5th, "I finally understand what it means to serve the country. It's not just about fighting, it's about being part of a bigger family, a family that extends across the entire ocean." Working alongside Ronald in Compartment A111 were his 2 work companions and close friends, Clifford Michael Olds and Louis Anthony Costin. Clifford Olds, 20 years old, was from Detroit, Michigan. Son of a Ford worker, he had grown up with the sound of pneumatic hammers and the smell of hot metal. Clifford was taller than Ronald, 6 feet, and had the robust build of someone who had worked on assembly lines since age 16. His hair was coal black, always combed back with military precision, and he had a small scar above his left eyebrow, the result of a factory accident when he was 17. Clifford was known for his contagious laugh and his impressive ability to imitate accents. He could do a perfect imitation of the ship's commander that left the entire mess hall in stitches. But behind the humor, Clifford carried the responsibility of being his family's main breadwinner. His father had lost his job at Ford in 1940, and Clifford's Navy salary was what kept his mother and two younger sisters fed and with a roof over their heads. In his letters home, Clifford wrote mainly to his younger sister, Sarah, who was 12. He had promised her that when he returned from the Navy, he would buy a house big enough for the whole family, with a yard where she could have the dog she always wanted. "Hang in there, little one," he wrote. "Your big brother is going to take care of everything." And then there was Louis Anthony Costin, just 17 years old, the baby of the group. Louis was from a small fishing town in Maine, where he had grown up with the sound of waves crashing against rocks and the cry of seagulls. He was the smallest of the three, 5'7" and 140 pounds, but compensated for his size with inexhaustible energy and an optimism that sometimes irritated the older sailors. Louis had curly red hair that never stayed in place no matter how hard he tried, and a face covered with freckles that made him look even younger than he really was. He had lied about his age to enlist. Actually, he was only 16 when he signed the papers, but was desperate to escape the crushing poverty of his hometown. Louis's father had died in a fishing accident when he was 14, leaving his mother, Catherine, to raise 5 children alone. Louis was the oldest and felt the weight of responsibility on his thin shoulders. He enlisted not for adventure or patriotism, but out of pure and simple necessity. The money he sent home every week was the difference between his family having food on the table or going hungry. Despite the difficult circumstances, Louis maintained an incredibly positive spirit. He was known for his ability to find the good side of any situation, no matter how bad it was. When other sailors complained about the food, Louis would say, "At least it's not fish again." When they complained about the heat, he'd respond, "Better than Maine cold." His laugh was loud and genuine, and had the power to lift anyone's spirits around him. The 3 young men had become inseparable friends since being assigned to work together in Compartment A111. It wasn't very glamorous work. Basically, they were responsible for maintaining and organizing supplies and equipment in the ship's depths, but they turned the monotonous task into an adventure, competing to see who could organize supplies fastest, inventing games to pass time, and sharing stories of their lives before the Navy. Compartment A111 was located on the 3rd deck below the waterline in the bowels of the USS West Virginia. It was a claustrophobic space of approximately 10 by 13 feet, with a low ceiling that forced taller men like Clifford to stoop. The walls were standard navy gray painted steel, and the air always carried the characteristic smell of oil, metal, and the salty humidity that permeated all warships. The compartment was filled with metal shelves that went from floor to ceiling, organized with military precision. There were boxes of small ammunition, spare parts for various equipment, maintenance tools, electrical cables, and hundreds of other items essential for keeping a warship running. Each item had its specific place, and the 3 young men had memorized the location of everything. It was work that required attention to detail and meticulous organization, but also offered a certain independence. They worked mainly alone, without constant supervision, which gave them freedom to talk, joke, and develop the camaraderie that would become crucial in the terrible days to come. December 7th, 1941, 6:30 am. Ronald woke up before the alarm, as he always did. It was a farm habit he had never been able to break, waking up with the first ray of sun, no matter where he was. He dressed quietly so as not to wake his roommates and went up to the deck to watch the sunrise. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the Oahu Mountains rose majestically against the horizon. The air was fresh and clean, filled with the aroma of tropical flowers from nearby islands. Ronald breathed deeply, feeling grateful to be alive, to be in that paradisiacal place, to be part of something bigger than himself. He didn't know he was living his last moments of peace. At 7 a.m., Ronald went down to Compartment A111 to start his shift. Clifford and Louis were already there, organizing the weekly inventory that needed to be completed by the end of the day. It was a tedious but necessary task. Every item in the compartment needed to be counted, catalogued, and reported to superior officers. "Good morning, farmer," Clifford greeted Ronald with the affectionate nickname he had given him. "Ready for another exciting day counting bolts? At least we're not cleaning the bathrooms," Louis responded cheerfully, already waist-deep in a box of electrical cables. "My cousin Jimmy is on the destroyer next door, and he said he spent the whole week scrubbing latrines." Ronald laughed and picked up his clipboard. "Let's finish this quickly. I heard they're having a barbecue on the beach this afternoon and I don't want to miss it." The three young men worked in harmony, their voices echoing softly in the confined space as they counted and organized. They talked about their plans for the day, about letters they had received from home, about movies they wanted to see at the base cinema. It was normal, everyday conversation, the kind millions of young Americans were having at that same moment across the country. At 7:45 a.m., they heard the distant sound of airplane engines. It wasn't uncommon. Pearl Harbor was an active military base, and planes took off and landed regularly. Ronald didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Early training exercise today," Clifford commented, checking his medical supplies list. "Or maybe it's that squadron that was scheduled to arrive from San Diego," Louis suggested, organizing a pile of technical manuals. The sound of the engines got louder, and then even louder. Ronald frowned. There was something different about that sound, something he couldn't identify. It was sharper, more aggressive than the American planes he was used to hearing. At 7:55 a.m., they heard the first deafening roar of a plane passing very low over the ship. The sound was followed by a distant explosion that made the entire ship tremble. The three young men looked at each other, confused. "What the hell was that?" Clifford asked, dropping his clipboard. Ronald was about to answer when they heard something that would change their lives forever. The unmistakable sound of air raid sirens beginning to wail throughout Pearl Harbor. And then, at 7:57 a.m. on December 7, 1941, the world of Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Louis Costin exploded into pieces. 7:57 a.m., the first torpedo. The Japanese Type 91 torpedo hit the USS West Virginia on the port side, approximately 50 feet forward of turret number 2. The explosion was so violent that the entire ship jumped in the water like a wounded animal. In the depths of compartment A111, the impact was amplified and distorted by the metal, creating a deafening roar that seemed to come from all directions at once. Ronald was thrown against the steel wall with enough force to break 2 ribs. Clifford was hurled against a tool shelf, deeply cutting his scalp. Louis, who was crouched organizing a low box, was launched upward and hit his head on the compartment's low ceiling, becoming momentarily stunned. The lights went out instantly, plunging the compartment into absolute and terrifying darkness. The only sound was the metallic echo of the explosion reverberating through the ship's hull and the groans of pain from the 3 young men. "What the fuck was that?" Clifford screamed in the darkness, his voice distorted by pain and panic. He could feel warm blood running down his face but couldn't see anything. Ronald tried to get up, but a sharp pain in his chest made him double over. Each breath was agony. "I don't know," he managed to say through gritted teeth, "but we need to get out of here now." Louis was silent, still stunned by the impact. Ronald groped in the darkness until he found him, feeling his friend's smaller body trembling violently. Louis, are you okay?" I think so," Louis mumbled, his voice sounding distant and confused. "My head hurts a lot." 7:58 M, the second torpedo. Before they could fully orient themselves, a second torpedo hit the ship, this time closer to the compartment where they were. The impact was even more violent than the first, and this time they heard something that froze the blood in their veins, the unmistakable sound of metal being torn and water beginning to invade the ship. Shit, Clifford screamed, desperately groping in the darkness for the hatch that led out of the compartment. "We need to get out of here now." Ronald forced himself to ignore the pain in his chest and began moving toward where he remembered the exit was. His hands found the cold steel wall and he began following it, searching for the hatch. "Clifford, can you find a flashlight? Anything?" "I'm trying," Clifford responded, his voice high with panic. He could hear the sound of water getting louder, closer. "Louis, can you move?" Louis was trying to get up, but the dizziness from the head blow made him stagger. I think so. Where are we? I can't see anything." Ronald finally found the hatch. His hands groped the metal until he found the opening wheel. He tried to turn it, but it wouldn't move. He tried again, putting all his weight and strength into the attempt. Nothing. "The hatch is stuck," he screamed, panic beginning to take over his voice. "I can't open it." Clifford joined him, and the two young men tried to turn the wheel together. It didn't move even a millimeter. The torpedo impacts had deformed the ship's structure, jamming the hatch in place. Takem. Water invades. That's when they heard the most terrifying sound a sailor can hear. The roar of ocean water invading the ship. It started as a distant whisper, then grew to a murmur and finally became a deafening roar. "Water's coming in," Louis screamed, his voice breaking with terror. "We're going to drown." Ronald felt the first drop of ice-cold water hit his foot, then another. And then, within seconds, water began gushing through ventilation ducts and small openings in the compartment. The Pacific water was approximately 65 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause thermal shock, but not so cold as to kill them immediately. It rose quickly to their ankles, then to their shins, then to their knees. "We're going to die here," Louis sobbed, his young voice breaking completely. "We're going to die and nobody will even know where we are." But then, something unexpected happened. When the water reached approximately waist height for the three men, it stopped rising. The air in the compartment had been compressed by the incoming water, creating a pressurized air pocket that kept the water level stable. Ronald was the first to notice. "Wait," he said, his voice still tense but with a note of hope. The water stopped rising. Clifford stopped panicking long enough to notice that Ronald was right. "How is that possible?" "The air is being compressed," Ronald explained, remembering physics classes he had taken in high school. "It's like when you turn a glass upside down in water. The air gets trapped inside." Louis was still sobbing, but Ronald's explanation penetrated through his panic. Does that mean we won't drown?" "Not immediately," Ronald said, trying to sound more confident than he really felt. "But we need to find a way to get out of here." 5M. First signaling attempt. Clifford, who had stopped bleeding but still felt dizzy, began groping around the compartment for something useful. His hands found a toolbox that had fallen from a shelf during the impact. "I found tools," he shouted. "Maybe we can break the hatch." He opened the box and groped inside until he found a heavy sledgehammer. It was a standard emergency tool, designed to break damaged equipment or open passages in case of emergency. "Get out of the way," Clifford shouted, and began hitting the stuck hatch with all the strength he could muster. Bang! The sound of metal hitting metal echoed through the compartment, and more importantly, through the ship's hull. Bang, bang, bang. "Keep going," Ronald encouraged. Someone might hear this. Louis, inspired by Clifford's action, began screaming with all the strength of his lungs. "Help, we're trapped down here, someone help us." But their voices were muffled by the thick metal and the water around the ship. The only sound that had a chance of getting through was the sledgehammer hitting the hull. Bang, bang, bang. 8:15. Reality sets in. After 10 minutes of hitting the hatch, Clifford was exhausted. His hands were raw and his arms trembled with fatigue. The hatch hadn't moved even a millimeter. "It's not working," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "The damn thing is completely stuck." Ronald took the sledgehammer from Clifford's hands. "Then let's try something else. Let's hit the hull, not the hatch. Maybe someone outside can hear." He began hitting rhythmically on the compartment wall, creating a pattern he hoped would be recognized as a distress call. Bang, 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 bang. "Is it like Morse code?" Louis asked, his voice still trembling but with a hint of hope. "Not exactly," Ronald admitted, "but it's a rhythm. If someone hears it, they'll know there are people alive down here." And so began the ritual that would define the next 16 days of their lives. Every few minutes, one of them would take the sledgehammer and hit the hull, creating the desperate sound that would echo through Pearl Harbor like a funeral drum. Bang, bang, bang. 8:30 a.m. Finding light. Louis, groping around the compartment, finally found something that brought some relief, a waterproof emergency flashlight that had fallen from a high shelf during the impact. "I found a flashlight," he shouted, and when he turned it on, the compartment was bathed in weak but precious light. For the first time since the attack, they could see where they were and assess their situation. What they saw was not encouraging. The compartment was partially flooded with ice-cold water up to their waists. Several shelves had collapsed, scattering supplies everywhere. The hatch was visibly deformed, with the metal bent in a way that made it obvious why they couldn't open it. But they could also see that they had some resources. There were several boxes of emergency supplies that hadn't been damaged, including some rations, and more importantly, access to drinking water through a pipe that still worked. "Well," Ronald said, trying to maintain an optimistic tone. "At least we won't die of thirst." Clifford examined the wound on his head, using the water's reflection. It was ugly, but didn't seem fatal. "And you guys? How are you?" Ronald touched his broken ribs and grimaced. Sore but alive, Louis had an impressive bump on his head, but seemed to be recovering from the initial stunning. "I think I'll be okay." 3 a.m. The first plan. With the flashlight's light, they could examine the compartment more thoroughly and begin making plans. Ronald, who had grown up solving practical problems on the farm, naturally assumed the role of leader. "All right," he said, "let's think about this logically. We're trapped, but we're alive. We have water, we have some food, and we have air to breathe. Someone outside must know the ship was attacked, so rescue teams will come." "How long do you think it will take?" Louis asked, his voice still laden with fear. "I don't know," Ronald admitted. "But meanwhile, we need to keep ourselves alive and keep signaling our position." They established a system. Every 15 minutes, one of them would hit the hull for 2 minutes, creating a consistent pattern they hoped would be noticed by rescue teams. Clifford took the sledgehammer for the first official shift. Bang, bang, bang. The sound echoed through the metal, traveling through the water and reaching the surface, where the first responders were already arriving to assess the damage at Pearl Harbor. Up there, the world had changed forever. The Japanese attack had killed more than 2,400 Americans and wounded another 1,000. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed. The United States was officially at war. But in the depths of the USS West Virginia, 3 young Americans were just beginning their own private war, a battle for survival that would test the limits of human endurance and hope. Bang, bang, bang. The sound continued, a metallic heartbeat in the ocean depths, marking the beginning of an ordeal that would last 16 days and forever change everyone who heard it. Day 1, December 7th, 1941. 10 a.m. Establishing routines. In the first hours after being trapped, the 3 young sailors did what trained soldiers do. They established a routine. Ronald, with his practical farm experience, assumed the role of coordinator. Clifford, with his physical strength, became responsible for the main signaling. Louis, despite being the youngest, showed a natural aptitude for keeping morale high. "We need to ration everything," Ronald said, examining the available supplies in the flashlight's weak light. "We don't know how long we'll be here." They had found 3 cans of emergency rations, some Navy chocolate bars, and dry biscuits. It wasn't much, but it could sustain them for a few days if they were careful. Water was less of a concern. The pipe that supplied drinking water still worked, although the pressure was low. They could fill their canteens and some containers they found among the scattered supplies. "Let's eat 1 small meal every 8 hours, Ronald decided, "and let's keep hitting the hull every 15 minutes. 5 p.m. First signs of rescue. Around 2 in the afternoon, they heard something that made their hearts leap with hope. Human voices coming from above, muffled but clearly audible through the hull. "Did you hear that?" Louis whispered, as if speaking loudly might make the voices disappear. "Yes." Clifford immediately grabbed the sledgehammer and began hitting with renewed force. Bang, bang, bang. "Help!" Ronald screamed with all the strength of his lungs. "We're down here, compartment A111. For a moment, the voices above stopped. The 3 young men held their breath, waiting. Then the voices resumed, but this time they seemed more urgent, more focused. "They heard us!" Louis shouted, tears of relief streaming down his face. "They know we're here." Clifford continued hitting, creating a constant loud rhythm. Bang, bang, bang. The voices above responded, getting closer. 5 p.m., the first disappointment. After 2 hours of intense signaling and shouting, the voices above moved away. The silence that followed was deafening. "Where did they go?" Louis asked, his voice breaking. "Why did they leave?" Ronald tried to stay calm, but was also confused and scared. Maybe they went to get rescue equipment to get us out of here. But deep down he was beginning to suspect the terrible truth that the rescuers knew exactly where they were, but couldn't do anything to help them without risking killing them in the process. 5 p.m., the first night. When darkness fell over Pearl Harbor, the 3 young men faced their first night in the flooded compartment. The temperature had dropped, and the ice-cold water around their waists was beginning to cause hypothermia. They huddled together to share body heat, using pieces of canvas and fabric they found to cover themselves. The flashlight was getting dim, so they turned it off to conserve the battery, plunging back into total darkness. "Tell me about your homes," Ronald said in the darkness, trying to keep everyone awake and talking. "Louis, what's Maine like?" Louis, shivering violently from cold, began describing the cold mornings in his hometown, the smell of the ocean, the sound of seagulls. His voice was weak, but talking seemed to help him stay focused. Clifford talked about Detroit, about the sound of assembly lines, about his little sister Sarah, and how she always waited for him at the window when he came home from work. Ronald described the mornings on the farm, the smell of freshly cut hay, the sound of birds singing in the barn. They were simple, everyday stories, but in the cold darkness of the compartment, they became anchors of sanity, reminders that there was a world out there waiting for them. Every 15 minutes, one of them took the sledgehammer and hit the hull. Bang, bang, bang. The sound echoed in the night, a desperate plea for help that no one could answer. Day 2, December 8th, 1941. AM, morning of realization. Ronald woke up first, as he always did. For a confused moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the pain in his ribs and the feeling of ice-cold water around his waist brought it all back. They had survived the first night. Clifford and Louis were still sleeping, huddled together like puppies seeking warmth. Ronald let them sleep a little longer and took the sledgehammer for the morning shift. Bang, bang, bang. The sound echoed through the hull, and almost immediately, he heard voices responding above. His heart jumped. The rescue teams were still there. "Clifford, Louis, wake up," he whispered urgently. "There are people up there." The two young men woke instantly, and soon all three were shouting and hitting the hull with renewed hope. 10 p.m., the commander's visit. Above, Salvage Commander William Sullivan was having the most difficult conversation of his military career. He was talking to Captain Mervyn Bennion, commander of the USS West Virginia, who had been mortally wounded in the attack but was still conscious. "Sir," Sullivan said, his voice heavy, "we confirm there are survivors in compartment A111. 3 men, by our calculations." Bennion, lying on an improvised stretcher on the deck, closed his eyes. "Options, Commander?" "Limited, sir. The compartment is partially flooded, but they have an air pocket. If we try to cut the hull to get them out, water pressure will flood the compartment instantly. And if we do nothing," Sullivan hesitated, "they'll die slowly, sir. Hunger, thirst, hypothermia, or carbon dioxide poisoning when the air gets stale." Bennion opened his eyes and looked at the blue Hawaiian sky. "How old are they?" 17, 19, and 20 years old, sir." Silence stretched between the two men. Finally, Bennion spoke. "Continue monitoring the situation, Commander, and keep this classified. I don't want this leaking to the press." 2 p.m. Signs of deterioration. In the compartment, the effects of prolonged exposure to cold were beginning to manifest. Louis, being the smallest and youngest, was suffering the most. His lips were blue and he was shaking uncontrollably. I need to get warm," he mumbled, his teeth chattering violently. Ronald and Clifford positioned themselves on each side of him, sharing their body heat. But they all knew this was just a temporary measure. "Let's do exercises," Ronald decided, "movements to keep the blood circulating." They began doing modified push-ups, squats in the water, anything to generate body heat. It was exhausting and painful, especially with Ronald's broken ribs, but it was necessary. 1 p.m. The first argument. Tension and stress were beginning to affect the group. When it was Louis's turn to hit the hull, he hesitated. "What's the point?" he asked, his voice bitter. "They know we're here. If they could get us out, they would have done it already." "We can't give up," Clifford said firmly. "As long as we're alive, we have to keep trying." "Trying what?" Louis exploded. "We're trapped in a metal can at the bottom of the ocean. Nobody can help us." Ronald intervened before the argument escalated. "Louis is right to be scared. We all are. But Clifford is also right. We can't give up. Maybe they're working on a solution. Maybe they need time to figure out how to get us out safely." Louis looked at his two friends, tears streaming down his face. I just want to see my mother again." "You will," Ronald said, putting a hand on the young man's shoulder. "All of us will, but we have to stay alive until then." 3, December 9th, 1941. M. Severe rationing. On the morning of the third day, they took a grim inventory of their supplies. Food was running out faster than expected, mainly because the cold was making their bodies burn more calories to stay warm. "We have food for 2 more days, maybe 3 if we're very careful," Ronald reported. "And then?" Clifford asked. Then we'll have to survive on water alone until they rescue us. The reality of the situation was becoming undeniable. They wouldn't be rescued quickly. This would be an endurance test. 12 p.m. Change in signaling strategy. Above, Petty Officer First Class James Morrison was making his security rounds when he heard the banging coming from below. He stopped and put his ear to the hull. Bang, bang, bang. Morrison had been specifically assigned to monitor the survivors. It was a job nobody wanted, listening to men die slowly and being unable to do anything to help. He took out his notepad and recorded, December 9th, 12 p.m. Sound signals continue from compartment A111. Consistent rhythm, strength unchanged. But Morrison noticed something else. The banging was coming in different patterns now. Sometimes they were fast and urgent. Other times they were slow and rhythmic. The men down there were trying to communicate. p.m. The first loss of hope. Louis was getting weaker. The combination of cold, hunger, and psychological stress was taking its toll on the 17-year-old. He had stopped participating in exercise sessions and spent most of his time huddled in a corner, shivering. "Louis," Ronald said gently, "I need you to eat something." "I'm not hungry," Louis mumbled, although his stomach was obviously rumbling. "It's not about being hungry. It's about staying alive." Louis looked at Ronald with eyes that seemed much older than his 17 years. "For what? To die here a few days later?" Clifford joined the conversation. "Because your mother is waiting for you to come home. Because you promised her you'd take care of the family." The mention of his mother made Louis start crying. "She doesn't even know where I am. She doesn't even know I'm dead." "You're not dead," Ronald said firmly. "You're alive and you're going to stay alive. We're all getting out of here." But even as he said the words, Ronald was beginning to have his own doubts. Day 4, December 10th, 1941. 6 a.m. Signs of illness. Ronald woke up with a dry cough he couldn't stop. The air in the compartment was getting stale. Too much carbon dioxide and not enough oxygen. His lungs burned with each breath. Clifford was also coughing and Louis had developed a low fever. They were getting sick and there were no medications available. "We need fresh air," Clifford said, his voice hoarse. "There is no fresh air," Ronald replied. "Only what we have here." They tried to find other sources of ventilation in the compartment, but all openings were blocked by water or debris. 2 p.m. The improvised diary. Ronald had an idea. Using a sharp piece of metal he found among the debris, he began scratching marks on the compartment wall. 1 mark for each day they spent there. "What are you doing?" Clifford asked. "Keeping a record," Ronald replied. If we don't get out of here, at least someone will know how long we survived." It was a grim thought, but also practical. Ronald scratched 4 lines on the metal wall, 1 for each day they had spent in the compartment. 2 p.m. Stories to maintain sanity. To combat growing despair, they established a new nightly routine. Each would tell a detailed story from their life before the war, trying to keep their minds occupied and away from the terrible reality of their situation. That night, it was Clifford's turn. He told about the day his sister Sarah was born, how he had held that tiny baby in his arms and promised he would always take care of her. "She had these huge eyes," he said, his voice soft in the darkness. "And when she looked at me, it was like she knew I was her big brother, like she knew she could trust me." Louis, despite his fever, smiled. "She must miss you." "Yes," Clifford said, "and I'm going back to her. No matter what happens, I'm going back." December 11th, 1941, 10:22 a.m. Food runs out. They ate the last ration that morning. It wasn't much, some dry biscuits and a bit of canned meat, but it was all they had. "And now?" Louis asked, his voice weak. "Now we survive on water," Ronald said. "The human body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. We have water, so we have a chance." But they all knew that hunger would make everything harder. They would get weaker, more susceptible to cold, less able to maintain high morale. 4 p.m. First hallucination. Louis began seeing things that weren't there. He pointed to a corner of the compartment and said, "Do you see that light? There's an exit there." Ronald and Clifford looked, but there was nothing but the dark metal wall. "Louis," Ronald said gently, "there's no light there." "But I can see it," Louis insisted, trying to move toward the corner. "It's an exit. We can get out that way." Clifford held the young man before he could hurt himself. "There's no exit, buddy. You're seeing things because of the fever. Lewis struggled against Clifford for a moment, then collapsed in tears. I just want to get out of here. I just want to go home. PM. Difficult decision. That night, Ronald and Clifford had a whispered conversation while Lewis slept fitfully. He's getting worse, Clifford said. The fever, the hallucinations. I don't know how much longer he can hold on. We have to take care of him, Ronald replied. He's the youngest. If we can keep him alive, maybe... Maybe what? Ronald, do you really think someone's going to get us out of here? Ronald was silent for a long moment. I have to believe that, because if I don't believe it, I'll go crazy. Day 6, December 12th, 1941. AM. Growing weakness. The lack of food was beginning to seriously affect all three. Their movements were slower, their voices weaker. The simple act of picking up the sledgehammer to hit the hull had become a Herculean effort, but they continued. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was weaker now, but still audible. 2 p.m. Food memories. To combat constant hunger, they began describing in elaborate detail their favorite meals from home. My mother made the best apple pie in the county, Ronald said, his eyes closed as if he could visualize his home kitchen. She used apples from our own orchard, and the whole house smelled like cinnamon when it was baking. My Italian grandmother made this tomato sauce, Clifford added. She cooked all day, and you could smell it blocks away. And the bread. She made fresh bread every morning. Lewis, despite his weakness, smiled. My mother made fish soup. She used whatever my father caught that day. It was never the same twice, but it was always perfect. It was torture and comfort at the same time. Remembering food made them feel hungrier, but also connected them to home, to love, to the life they hoped to resume. Day 7, December 13th, 1941. Curtis AM. A week in hell. Ronald scratched the 7th mark on the wall. A whole week. They had survived a whole week in that flooded compartment. 1 week, he said aloud, more to himself than to the others. Feels like an eternity, Clifford mumbled. Louis didn't respond. He was sleeping more now, conserving energy he didn't have. 2 p.m. change above. Above, Guard Morrison was making his daily report to Commander Sullivan. The banging continues, sir, he reported, but it's getting weaker and less frequent. Sullivan nodded grimly. How long do you think they have? Hard to say, sir. They have water, so maybe another week. 2, if they're lucky. And there's still no way to get them out. Not without killing them in the process, sir. The water pressure... Sullivan waved his hand. I know, Guard, keep monitoring. After Morrison left, Sullivan was alone with his thoughts. 3 young Americans were dying slowly right beneath his feet, and he couldn't do anything to save them. It was the kind of decision that would haunt a man for the rest of his life. Quinsem. Louis gets worse. Lewis was delirious more frequently now. He talked to people who weren't there, answered questions no one had asked. Yes, Mom, I'll go fishing with you tomorrow, he mumbled, his eyes closed. We'll catch lots of fish, we'll fill the boat. Ronald and Clifford exchanged worried looks. Lewis was clearly getting worse, and there was nothing they could do to help him. Maybe it's better this way, Clifford whispered. At least he's not suffering as much. Don't say that, Ronald scolded. He's going to be fine. We're all going to be fine. But even as he said the words, Ronald could see that Lewis was drifting away from them, losing himself in a world of fever and hallucinations. Day 8, December 14th, 1941. Pondem, the first death. Ronald woke up to silence. It took a moment to realize what was wrong. Louis was no longer breathing. Clifford, he whispered urgently. Clifford, wake up. Clifford opened his eyes immediately. What is it? It's Louis. I think he's gone. The 2 young men approached their friend's body. Louis was lying peacefully as if he were just sleeping. But when Ronald touched his neck, there was no pulse. Shit, Clifford whispered, tears beginning to stream down his face. Shit, shit, shit. Ronald gently closed Lewis's eyes. The 17-year-old looked even younger in death, almost like a child. He didn't suffer, Ronald said, as much to convince himself as Clifford. He just went. Toistis hanicum pregam, dealing with loss. They moved Lewis's body to the farthest corner of the compartment. There was no way to preserve it properly, but they did the best they could, covering it with pieces of canvas. Should we say some words? Clifford asked. Ronald nodded. They weren't particularly religious, but it seemed appropriate. Louis Anthony Costin, Ronald began, his voice breaking. 17 years old, son, brother, friend. He died far from home, but he didn't die alone. He died with honor serving his country. Clifford added, he always tried to cheer us up, always found the good side of things. Let's try to remember him that way. They stood in silence for a few minutes, paying their last respects to their friend. 2 p.m. Just 2. Now it was just Ronald and Clifford. The compartment seemed bigger and emptier without Lewis's animated presence. How long do you think we have? Clifford asked. Ronald considered the question honestly. Without food? Maybe a week too if we're lucky. Our bodies will start consuming muscle and fat. We'll get weaker, more susceptible to cold. And then we'll join Lewis. It was a brutal conversation but necessary. They needed to face the reality of their situation. 8 p.m. Promises. That night, Ronald and Clifford made promises to each other. If I die first, Clifford said, I want you to tell my sister Sarah that I was thinking of her at the end, that I loved her. You're not going to die first, Ronald replied. But if I die first, tell my mother that I wasn't afraid, that I died like a man. Neither of us is going to die, Clifford said, with renewed determination. We're getting out of here. For our families, for Lewis, for ourselves. Ronald nodded, but deep down, he was beginning to lose hope. Day 9, December 15th, 1941. 10 p.m. Signs of physical deterioration. The lack of food was taking its toll. Ronald had lost at least 15 pounds, and Clifford, being bigger, was suffering even more. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken, but the worst was the weakness. Simple tasks like picking up the sledgehammer or moving around the compartment had become monumental efforts. I don't know if I can keep hitting the hull, Clifford admitted. I can barely lift the sledgehammer. Then we'll take turns more frequently, Ronald suggested. Shorter hits, but more frequent. PM, deeper memories. To keep their minds occupied, they began sharing more intimate, more personal memories. Have you ever been in love? Clifford asked. Ronald smiled weakly. There was a girl at school, Mary Ellen Thompson. Blonde hair, green eyes. I never had the courage to talk to her. I had a girlfriend in Detroit, Clifford said. Betty Morrison. We were going to get married when I came back from the Navy. I even bought a ring. Where's the ring? In my locker, on the ship. If I don't get out of here, I hope someone gives it to her, so she knows I was thinking of her. Day 10, December 16th, 1941. 6 a.m. 10 days. Ronald scratched the 10th mark on the wall. 10 days. They had survived 10 days without food, with only water and willpower. 10 days, he said aloud. Clifford just nodded. He was conserving energy, speaking only when necessary. 2 p.m. Hallucinations begin. Ronald began seeing things. First, they were just shadows in the corner of his vision, but then they became more defined. He saw his mother standing in the corner of the compartment, smiling at him. Mom, he whispered. There's nobody there, Clifford said gently. It's the hunger. It's messing with your head. Ronald blinked and the vision disappeared. I know, but it seemed so real. 10 p.m. Plans for the end. That night, they had a conversation no 19 and 20-year-olds should have. When one of us dies, Ronald said, the other should keep hitting the hull until the end. Why? Because as long as there's sound, there's hope. For us, for our families, for anyone who's listening. Clifford agreed. And when the last of us dies, then at least they'll know when it happened. At least there will be a definitive ending. Day 11, December 17th, 1941. 8 a.m. Clifford weakens. Clifford was clearly getting worse. Being bigger than Ronald, his body needed more calories to function, and the lack of food was affecting him more severely. I can't get up, he mumbled. Ronald crawled over to him. Don't try. Conserve energy. But the signaling, I'll take care of it, you rest. Ronald picked up the sledgehammer, which now seemed to weigh a ton, and began hitting weakly on the hull. Bang! 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 5 p.m. Memories of strength. To motivate himself to continue, Ronald began remembering moments when he felt strongest in his life. The day he helped his father build a new barn, the time he carried a sick calf 3 miles to the veterinarian, the morning he woke up and decided to enlist in the Navy. I was strong, he mumbled to himself. I can be strong again. Day 12, December 18th, 1941. 12 p.m. Clifford stops responding. Ronald woke up to find Clifford unconscious. He was still breathing, but didn't respond when Ronald spoke to him. "Clifford, Clifford, can you hear me?" There was no response. Clifford had entered a coma, his body finally succumbing to hunger and stress. Ronald was alone now, except for the bodies of his two friends. PM. Alone. For the first time in 12 days, Ronald was completely alone in the compartment. The silence was deafening. Without his friends' voices, without their breathing, there was only the sound of water gently lapping the compartment walls. But Ronald continued hitting the hull. Bang, bang, bang. Weaker now, but still audible. "I promised," he whispered to his friends' bodies. "I promised to continue until the end." The 13th, December 19th, 1941. 10 Bam. Clifford dies. Ronald woke up to find Clifford dead. His friend had died quietly during the night without apparent pain. Now Ronald was truly alone. He moved Clifford's body next to Louis's, covering both with canvas, two young Americans who would never see their families again. "I'll tell your stories," Ronald promised the bodies. "If I get out of here, I'll tell the world about you." Times PM. Inner strength. Alone, Ronald found a reserve of strength he didn't know he possessed. Maybe it was the responsibility of being the last survivor. Maybe it was the promise he had made to his friends. Or maybe it was simply the stubbornness of a farm boy who had been raised never to give up. He continued hitting the hull. Bang, bang, bang. Day 14, December 20th, 1941. 8 a.m. Visions of home. Ronald was having constant visions now. He saw his farm, his family, his life before the war. The visions were so vivid that sometimes he forgot where he was, but he always returned to reality when he tried to move and felt the ice-cold water around his waist. 4 p.m. The last letter. Using a sharp piece of metal, Ronald began scratching a message on the compartment wall. It was slow, painful, but he was determined to leave a record. "To whoever finds this," he scratched laboriously. "We are Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, Louis Costin, USS West Virginia. We died serving our country. Tell our families we weren't afraid." Day 15, December 21st, 1941. 12 p.m. Almost the end. Ronald could barely move now. Each breath was an effort, but he could still lift the sledgehammer, still hit the hull. Bang, bang, bang. Weaker than ever, but still audible. 11 p.m. Last words. Ronald knew he was dying. He could feel his body shutting down, system by system. "Mom," he whispered in the darkness, "I tried to be a good son. I tried to make you proud." He thought of Mary Ellen Thompson, the girl he never had the courage to approach. He thought of all the sunrises he would never see, all the harvests he would never help bring in, but mostly he thought of his two friends who had died beside him. They had faced the end with courage, and he would do the same. Day 16, December 22nd, 1941. 6 a.m. The last day. Ronald woke up knowing it would be his last day. He could feel it in his bones, in his heart that beat irregularly, in his lungs that struggled for each breath. But he still had one thing to do. 2:30 p.m., the last banging. With the last of his strength, Ronald picked up the sledgehammer one last time. His hands trembled violently, and he could barely lift it. Bang. One weak hit, almost inaudible. Bang. Even weaker. Bang. And then silence. Ronald Endicott, 19 years old, from Zanesville, Ohio, died holding the sledgehammer, fulfilling his promise to continue signaling until the end. December 23rd, 1941, 2:30 p.m. Above. Petty Officer First Class James Morrison was making his security rounds on the semi-submerged hull of the USS West Virginia when he noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Silence. Morrison stopped mid-step, frowning. Something was wrong. It took him a moment to realize what it was. For the first time in 16 days, there was no banging coming from below. He knelt on the metal hull and put his ear to the cold surface. Nothing. Just the sound of waves lapping the ship and the distant cry of seagulls. Bang, bang, bang! That sound had become part of Pearl Harbor's soundtrack. The guards, salvage workers, officers, everyone had gotten used to the constant, desperate rhythm coming from the depths of the West Virginia. It was a constant reminder that there were living men down there, men who were dying slowly while the world moved on. And now, there was silence. Morrison felt his stomach sink. He knew what the silence meant. After 16 days of agony, the last survivors of Compartment A111 had finally succumbed. He ran to find Commander Sullivan, his footsteps echoing on the metal deck. He found the commander in his temporary tent, reviewing salvage reports. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice tense, "the banging has stopped." Sullivan slowly looked up from his papers. For a moment, the two men stared at each other in silence. Both knew what this meant. "When?" Sullivan asked finally. "I just noticed, sir. Must have been recently." Sullivan looked at his watch. 2:35 p.m. He picked up his pen and wrote in his official diary, December 23rd, 1941, approximately 2:30 p.m. Sound signals from Compartment A111 have ceased. We presume there are no more survivors. But even as he wrote the official words, Sullivan knew they didn't capture the reality of what had happened. 3 young Americans had just died in the slowest and most agonizing way possible, and he had been forced to listen to them die. Morrison remained standing, clearly disturbed. "Sir, what do we do now?" "Now," Sullivan said, closing his diary, "we continue with salvage operations, and we keep this in absolute secrecy. Sir, guard Morrison. What happened here cannot leak to the press. It cannot reach the families. The last thing we need is a story about men dying slowly while we couldn't do anything to save them. That would be devastating to morale." Morrison nodded, but Sullivan could see the moral struggle in the young guard's eyes. "Understood, sir." After Morrison left, Sullivan was alone with his thoughts. He had made many difficult decisions in his military career, but this would be the one that haunted him forever. 3 young men had died under his responsibility, and he hadn't been able to do anything to save them. Worse still, he had been forced to listen to them die. Day after day, the sound of those desperate bangs had echoed through Pearl Harbor like a funeral drum, and now there was silence. Sullivan took a bottle of whiskey he kept on his desk and poured a glass. It wasn't something he would normally do during duty hours, but these weren't normal circumstances. He raised the glass toward the West Virginia's hull. "Ronald Endicott, Clifford Oles, Louis Costin," he said quietly. "May God have mercy on your souls, and may he forgive me for not being able to save you." The Discovery, January 1942, January 15th, 1942. 3 weeks after the final silence, salvage teams finally gained access to Compartment A111. The process was slow and meticulous. They had to carefully drain sections of the ship to avoid additional structural damage. Salvage technician Robert Chen was the first to enter the compartment. What he found would mark him for the rest of his life. The 3 bodies were arranged in a way that told a silent but powerful story. Louis Costin was in the farthest corner, carefully covered with canvas. Clifford Oles was beside him, also respectfully covered, and Ronald Endicott was in the center of the compartment, still holding the emergency sledgehammer. "Jesus Christ," Chen murmured, his voice echoing in the confined space. But it was when he saw the wall that Chen truly understood the magnitude of what had happened. Scratched into the metal were 16 marks, 1 for each day the young men had survived, and below the marks, laboriously scratched into the steel, was Ronald's final message. "To whoever finds this, we are Ronald Endicott, Clifford Oles, Louis Costin, USS West Virginia. We died serving our country. Tell our families we weren't afraid." Chen called Commander Sullivan, who personally descended to see the compartment. When Sullivan read the message on the wall, he had to lean against the ship's structure to keep from falling. 16 days, he whispered. They survived 16 days. The subsequent investigation revealed details that made the tragedy even more moving. The young men had carefully rationed their limited supplies. They had cared for each other until the end. And Ronald had continued signaling even after his friends died, fulfilling a promise he had made to them. The cover-up. February 1942. The United States Navy made a decision that would be controversial for decades: classify the details of the 3 sailors' deaths as sensitive national security information. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, personally ordered the secrecy. In a confidential memorandum, he wrote, "While we recognize the extraordinary heroism demonstrated by Seaman Endicott, Olds, and Costin, disclosure of the details of their death would be detrimental to troop morale and American public confidence in the Navy's ability to protect its men. This information must remain classified indefinitely." The families of the 3 young men received standard telegrams informing them that their sons had died heroically in action during the Pearl Harbor attack. Nothing was mentioned about the 16 days of agony, about the desperate banging on the hull, or about the impossibility of rescuing them. Margaret Endicott, Ronald's mother, received the telegram at her farm in Ohio. She read it once, folded it carefully, and never spoke about the war again. Neighbors reported that she continued setting a place at the table for Ronald every night until her own death in 1963. Catherine Costin, Louis's mother, fell into deep depression after receiving the news. She never fully recovered from the loss of her eldest son and died in 1948 at age 45, from what doctors called a broken heart. The Olds family in Detroit received the news with a mixture of pride and devastation. Sarah Olds, Clifford's younger sister, kept his room exactly as he had left it until she married and left home in 1950. She never knew about the engagement ring Clifford had bought for Betty Morrison. The men who listened. Guard James Morrison never fully recovered from the experience of listening to the three young men die slowly. He developed what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, although at the time there was no name or treatment for the condition. Morrison reported in his personal memoirs, written decades later, "For years after the war, I would wake up in the middle of the night hearing those phantom bangs. Bang, bang, bang. It was as if the spirits of those boys were haunting me, reminding me that I had failed to save them. I knew where they were, I could hear them dying, and I couldn't do anything." Morrison never married, never had children. He spent the rest of his life working solitary jobs, unable to form deep connections with other people. He died in 1987 at age 67, alone in a small apartment in San Diego. Commander William Sullivan carried the guilt for the rest of his military career. In his memoirs, published only in 1995, 50 years after the war's end, he wrote, "I made many difficult decisions during the war. I ordered men into battles, knowing some wouldn't survive. I sacrificed ships to save others. But nothing compares to the agony of listening to those three young men die slowly and knowing there was nothing I could do to save them. That's a guilt I carry to this day." Sullivan retired from the Navy in 1946 with the rank of Rear Admiral, but never accepted the decorations offered to him for his service at Pearl Harbor. "I don't deserve medals," he told a reporter in 1975. "Not when I let 3 boys die." There the truth emerges. 1991, 50 years later. The truth about Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds and Louis Costin finally came to light in 1991 when Navy documents were declassified as part of the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Dr. Daniel Martinez, historian at the Pearl Harbor Memorial, was the first to discover the detailed records of the incident. He was shocked by what he found. "This is one of the most moving and tragic stories that has ever emerged from Pearl Harbor," Martinez said in an interview. "These 3 young men showed extraordinary courage and endurance. They should be remembered as heroes, not forgotten in classified files." Martinez initiated a campaign to properly honor the memory of the 3 sailors. He contacted surviving family members, many of whom were shocked to discover the real details of how their relatives had died. Sarah Olds Patterson, then 62 years old, was Clifford's only surviving sister. When she learned the truth, she said, "All these years I thought my brother had died quickly in the explosion. Knowing that he suffered for so long, it's devastating. But I'm also proud he didn't give up, he fought until the end." The belated memorial. December 7th, 1996. On the 55th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, a small memorial was finally erected to honor Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Louis Costin. The ceremony was simple but moving, with representatives from all 3 families present. The memorial consists of a bronze plaque mounted on the hull of the USS Missouri, which is permanently anchored at Pearl Harbor. The plaque reads, "In memory of Ronald James Endicott, Clifford Michael Olds and Louis Anthony Costin, sailors of the USS West Virginia, who survived 16 days in compartment A111 after the December 7, 1941 attack. Their courage, endurance, and dedication to each other exemplify the best of the American spirit. They were not forgotten." James Morrison, Jr., son of the guard who had heard the banging, attended the ceremony. He said, "My father never talked much about the war, but I knew something haunted him. Now I understand what. I hope this memorial brings some peace to his spirit, wherever he is." The lasting impact. The story of Ronald, Clifford, and Louis had a profound impact on how the United States Navy approaches impossible rescue situations. new protocols were developed to deal with survivors trapped in flooded compartments, including technology to provide air and supplies through small openings. Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer famous for discovering the Titanic, studied the case as part of his research on survival in underwater environments. He said, "What these three young men accomplished is extraordinary from a human survival standpoint. 16 days without food in ice-cold water, in a confined space, that's beyond the normal limits of human endurance. They survived through pure willpower and mutual care." The families today. 2021, 80 years later. Today, 80 years after Pearl Harbor, there are still living relatives of the three sailors. Robert Endicott, Ronald's great-nephew, is a farmer in Ohio who maintains the family property. He says, "I grew up hearing stories about Uncle Ronald, but never knew the real details until the 90s. When I discovered the truth, I was devastated, but also incredibly proud. He showed the kind of courage that defines our family." Maria Olds-Chenitz, Clifford's granddaughter, is a nurse in Detroit. She keeps a photo of her grandfather in his Navy uniform on her desk at the hospital. "He wanted to take care of people," she says. "I think he'd be proud to know his granddaughter followed a similar path." Thomas Costin. Lewis's nephew is a fisherman in Maine, like his uncle had been. He names each of his boats in honor of Louis. "He died far from the ocean he loved," Thomas says, "but at least now his story is known." The legacy. The story of Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Lewis Costin has become part of the official curriculum at the Pearl Harbor Memorial. Thousands of visitors each year learn about the three young men who showed that heroism isn't always about glorious acts of courage. Sometimes it's about enduring, about caring for each other, about never giving up, even when the situation seems impossible. Admiral John Richardson, former Chief of Naval Operations, said in 2016, "These three sailors exemplify the Navy's core values: honor, courage, and commitment. They honored their oath, showed extraordinary courage in the face of death, and maintained their commitment to each other until the end. They are true naval heroes." The story also inspired changes in military policy regarding transparency with families. Today, the Navy has strict protocols for informing families about the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths, even when those circumstances are difficult or disturbing. The remaining mystery. One aspect of the story remains a mystery. Why was Ronald able to survive longer than his two friends? Subsequent medical analyses suggested several possibilities. Dr. Sarah Chen, CUS, Navy survival medicine specialist, offered an explanation. Ronald was from a farm accustomed to hard physical work and adverse conditions. He was also slightly smaller than Clifford, so his body needed fewer calories. But more importantly, he assumed the role of caregiver for the other two. Sometimes having a responsibility, a purpose, can give a person the extra strength to continue when others would give up. Other experts point to psychological factors. Ronald had grown up solving practical problems, dealing with crises on the farm. He may have been better equipped mentally to handle the extreme situation, but perhaps the simplest explanation is also the most powerful. Ronald had promised his friends that he would continue signaling until the end, and he kept that promise even when it meant continuing to live in agony. Today, when you visit Pearl Harbor, you can walk on the deck of the USS Missouri and see the memorial for Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Lewis Costin. It's a small plaque, easily missed among the larger, more grandiose monuments. But for those who know the story, it's one of the most powerful memorials in the entire complex, because this isn't a story about military glory or heroic victory. It's a story about three ordinary young men who faced extraordinary circumstances and showed that true heroism isn't in grand acts of courage, but in the refusal to give up, in caring for each other, in maintaining hope even when all hope seems lost. Bang, bang, bang. That sound echoed through Pearl Harbor for 16 days in December 1941. It was the sound of despair, but it was also the sound of hope. It was the sound of three young Americans refusing to die quietly, refusing to be forgotten. And although their banging finally stopped that afternoon of December 23rd, their story continues to echo. It reminds us that war isn't just about strategy and politics. It's about ordinary young people thrown into impossible situations, doing the best they can with what they have. Ronald Endicott never saw another sunrise over the Oahu Mountains. Clifford Olds never returned home to care for his little sister. Lewis Costin never fished again in the cold waters of Maine, but they didn't die in vain. Their story teaches us about endurance, about loyalty, about the power of the human spirit to resist even in the most desperate circumstances. They show us that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply refusing to give up. In the cold depths of the Pacific, 3 young Americans made a choice. They could have given in to despair, could have stopped fighting, could have died quietly. Instead, they chose to keep banging, keep hoping, keep caring for each other until their last breath. Bang, bang, bang. The sound may have stopped, but the message continues. Never give up, never stop fighting, never stop caring for each other. This is the true lesson of Pearl Harbor. Not just that we were attacked, not just that we entered the war, but that even in the darkest hours the human spirit can shine with a light that no darkness can extinguish. Ronald, Clifford, and Louis, 3 names that should be engraved in bronze alongside the other Pearl Harbor heroes. 3 young men who showed the world what it means to die with honor, live with purpose, and never, ever give up.